All right, guys. Hi, hello, good morning. I hope you're all well. What we got going on today is that we're going to be moving on to key issue 3 in chapter 13. We are so close to being done with all this content. So I'm going to go through this new information with you guys, and at the end, I've got some work to be completed. Please make sure that you're checking out all of the stuff that gets posted today onto Classroom. Some of it is very new information, some of it's going to be helpful for you guys to keep planning and looking ahead, all that kind of jazz. So just keep an eye out. All right. So into your notes, we're going to be talking about the stages of developing cities. As you've hopefully figured out, this whole process here. Chapter 13 is talking about urbanization, the creation of cities, how this sort of looks, how it plays out. In a lot of the original, thinking ancient spaces that we have discussed thus far, over in Southwest Asia and various places like that, again, they develop in a different way to a lot of what is the less developed world, because a lot of the less developed world was taken over, put under colonial rule at one point or another. So when you go to developing countries, you can oftentimes see that sort of the imprint. Oh, I cannot talk this morning. The imprint of that colonial rule on the city itself, because cities are going to be the centers of service, control, power, so on and so forth. So when you go to less developed countries, the pre-colonial cities before the Europeans arrived and started sticking their flags in the ground all over the place. Most people didn't live in the cities, similar to medieval Europe, where cities became kind of where you'd pass through. People would go there to trade, or they would stop in to get protection, figure out something with taxes, maybe, and then they would just go back to their own lives, living more agrarian or agricultural based, again, existences. They would be very few principal cities, kind of dotting the landscape of the various countries and nation states that had developed over time. Again, an example here would be looking in what at that point Central America, Mexico. The Aztecs, they built a major city where is again Mexico City today. But again, most of the people of the Aztec civilization didn't live there full time. They just came through when they needed things. Then, when the Europeans showed up, they would use or choose these different cities or create whole new ones, and they would basically expand upon them, because those cities would be where all of the colonial services were going to be located. What I mean by that is that would be the center of the colonial government, so administration would take place there. The military would usually set up shop within the city, again as a kind of command center. Any of the international trade that was going on, if European settlers came with them or decided to move to the colonies for various different reasons, they would go to the cities, and that's where you would see them. Of course, when the expansion of those cities would take place, those Europeans would bring with them a lot of the cultural norms of their own cities back in Europe. So you can see it in the architecture, you can see it in the actual arrangement of cities overall. Cities since independence, again, cities are going to be kind of the focal point. Excuse me, of change. Again, it's still going to be the seat of power, but that power is put back into the hands of the native people. And as we saw with the Industrial Revolution in Europe, cities are going to be where the jobs are. So huge amounts of people are going to be uprooting from the rural parts of the less developed world into the more urban spaces. Again, lots and lots of people, and not all of them are going to be able to afford to live there, as you've seen with your models. Thinking back to our Latin American model, especially the squatter settlements that develop on the edges of cities, it's because of the migration patterns. It's because these people are coming out here, and they're trying to get to where the jobs are, but unfortunately, there's only so many jobs at some one point, and not all of it is going to guarantee success. In some cities, such as Mexico City, previous social patterns from the previous century were reinforced. So it's almost like a reverting backwards, which is kind of an interesting trend that has happened in some of these cities. So just some pictures. Okay, so this is Mexico City during the Aztecs time. You can see here that there's a lot of people. There's obviously, again, a particular style to the architecture and the things that are looked at as, I guess, important. This is the impact of Spanish colonization. You can see here that almost always in or not Spanish, in colonized cities, there's going to be like a central square where you're going to see the seat of religion and power. And you can see there's large buildings that could, again, at this point, they're looking at administration buildings, again, where the military would be located. Again, of course, the Roman Catholic Church is going to be right there in the center of the city. Easy for all of those European colonizers to be able to get to everything that they need in an easy way. This right here is a modern day glimpse of Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world. You can see the absolute sprawl of the city itself as millions upon millions of people have moved there in search of work, again, looking for new opportunities. So, not every city is the same, and it's important to understand that there's certain different ways to define an urban settlement because of the differing kind of trends of expansion, I suppose, is one way of looking at it. So, of course, there's just the word city, which is an urban settlement that has been legally incorporated into an independent self governing unit. In the United States, these urban settlements are sometimes known as a central city. So, there is a city government, there's a council, or there is some kind of group of people who are in charge of making rules and controlling. The mayor would be in charge of the city center, central city overall. Then there's this idea of urban area, which has that dense core of census tracts, again, census, which I just filled out, which is kind of fun. Again, looking at that, keeping track of population, where is it, where are those people? And then there are the suburbs, which are closest. Suburbs are going to be neighborhoods that are removed from the central city, but still the people there are going to be tied to that CBD some way, whether that is through working still in the city or, again, having maybe students, again, kids go to school there or whatever it might be. There's still that close tie to it. And then there's the low density land that links the suburbs to the core because there's usually space in between unless the city has expanded into that space. Regardless, the census recognizes two types of urbanized areas. There is just urbanized area, which is at least 50,000 people live within it. And then there's urban cluster, which is smaller. So we're looking at a smaller, again, density, smaller amount of people, again, somewhere between 2,500 to 50,000 people overall. And when we are looking at the largest version of this is looking at metropolitan statistical area. You might have heard this in the news. That's really where they talk about it often, is in the metro area. Metro area is going to be those, again, places that are absolutely ginormous. Again, the census created this method of measuring a functional area of a city. Remember, functional region, which you learned about in the first unit, is looking at that idea of functional or nodal, that there is a central point, and then how far people are willing to get to that central point draws the outline of the region itself. An MSA, or a metropolitan area, is a good example of this. It includes the urbanized area. So you've got the central city plus the suburbs. There's at least 50,000 people. And then it usually is just going to, because it is so large scale, incorporate the county within the city is located. So they're going to bump it up to the county. And then any other adjacent county with a high population density, so there's a lot of people there, and a large number of residents who work in the central city. So there's that tie again. And that's what kind of links it all together, is that people are working in the central cities themselves. Some of these metro areas, they're actually so big and so close together that they overlap and they can form these kind of continuous sort of, again, urban complex. A good example of this is, again, extending north of Boston and south of DC. So if you're going to go from the tip top of the metro area of Boston all the way to the south part of Washington, D.C., all of that is going to be a highly dense population. And the people are all working in those cities, central cities. Again, this type of a region is referred to as a megapolis, which is Greek for great city. It's absolutely massive. That's the whole sort of idea here. So when you have these large scale populations overlapping with each other, what ends up happening is that local governments have to figure out, well, again, if some of my people work in your central city or some of my people live here but work there or the opposite, again, what is it? Who's in charge of who? So what ends up happening is that local government has to sort of fragment or figure out how they're going to manage all of this. So most US metro areas have a council of government, which is kind of like a cooperative agency consisting of various local government reps. The purpose, of course, is to be able to create some kind of a plan, or to monitor certain things that definitely couldn't be done by a singular government, to keep track of that sort of stuff because it is so big. There's so many people with so much going on. This right here is just a visual example of the Chicago area. So we're going to be looking at the urbanized area. I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking right here. We're looking at the city limits. So this is just the central city of Chicago. It's absolutely massive, third largest city in the United States. You can see here where the city limits have been bumped out as the time has gone on, as the city itself has grown. And then in the insert in the bottom left hand side is what the Chicago metro area is and how much it encompasses. Again, like I said, it's going to be our city and our, again, basically the urbanized area would be the Chicago suburbs, which are closest, and then bumping it out to each consecutive county where there is a high population and those people are going to be commuting into the city for work, that they're connected there, rely on those services for whatever it is that they might need. Okay. So as you can see here, this map right here talks about annexation, right? So what often happens here is that with cities, over time, because that is where jobs are going to be located, is going to be in cities, starting with manufacturing and then shifting into service in the mid-century for a lot of developed countries, is that cities need to grow. They need to get bigger, and areas that had once been under the control of other local governments, now it makes more sense for them to be under the control of the city government. And what they'll do is go through a process of annexation, which is legally adding land area to a city. Again, cities in the United States grew very rapidly in the 19th century. So thinking at the later part of the 1800s into the 1900s, and they've got better services, they've got better jobs, they've got more opportunities. There's going to be centers of culture and politics and all that kind of stuff. And as we get into the 1800s, that's where everyone wants to be. So it's something that happened in a lot of cities, is the annexation or the growth of those cities. When we look at this idea of population and population density, this is pretty a common sense idea, but it's just trying to reinforce this idea that there is a density gradient. Gradient, when you hear about that, again, I want you to think about the idea of different shades. That's really what gradient is. It's the idea of it's a really dark and then it gets lighter and lighter. When we're talking about density gradient, we're talking about the density or the intense, again, amount of people who are living. And in the United States, it tends to become less dense as you can travel further away from the city center. So right in the CBD, there is a ton of people and a ton of everything kind of right on top of each other. And as you travel away from that CBD, it gets a little bit less intense as you go the further out, so on and so forth. And where this density gradient is seen is through this idea of suburban sprawl. Again, this is an important idea, and I would definitely encourage you to maybe put a little star right here. But this is something that it's the flattening of a density gradient in a metro area. So we're seeing a huge drop off from the central city into the outer skirts of this, again, the metro area overall. And as you see that intense drop off, it starts to sort of flatten out as it becomes much more evenly dispersed. Remembering thinking density is this idea that there's all the frequency is very much, but things become much more, I guess, just even as you get into the suburbs, as you get further away. Again, the whole idea of that flattening out is that its peoples and services become much more evenly spread out, as opposed to in the CBD where things are very, very close together. Uh, Here in the United States, suburbs developed in the mid-century. We're thinking after World War II really is when the suburbs started to develop in our country. People started to, again, pick up and move out into areas where there was more space and they could own a home, all this kind of stuff. This is the way that it happened in the United States is referred to as sprawl. And when I look at the word sprawl, it's like a slow kind of encompassing sort of crawling, I guess, across the landscape. This progressive spread of development over this landscape. So you see this sort of movement outwards as we spread and we cover more and more land. People are still living close together. I mean, a suburb still provides a lot of different services to their people, but their suburb is always going to be connected back to that city center somehow. So it is this sort of and this reaching outwards of covering more and more space. So you can see in the United States in this graph, which is or this graphic, which is really important, I think, of understanding in here in the United States. So when you have a city, again, it develops through the 50s, 60s, and then we start to see, like I said, this sprawl outward as people along transportation routes in the United States. We are definitely going to be using roads are our way that we expand. Our train system is something by the 1950s is not not something used for personal use overall. So you can see here that along those, again, basically roads and those different sort of transportation routes, that suburbs and concentrations of people are going to start to move and spread slowly across the landscape. Again, just getting bigger and bigger and further away. That's not how it is in all developed countries. This is another example where the United States is kind of exceptional. When we're looking at again, places like the UK, there is, of course, going to be growth and kind of expansion of the cities themselves, but they have just a different way that they do things. They obviously have different ways of travel, which is going to be the roads and trains, and the transportation hubs are going to be where the suburbs of the United Kingdom are going to develop. And they develop almost in a round as opposed to that sort of sprawl that you see in the United States overall. Excuse me. So, when we're looking at this idea of cities growing and this sort of sprawl that happens here, that we're going to see that very often that there is going to be items of segregation within suburbs and then of course within cities themselves. In modern residential suburbs, there's really two different, I guess, ways of segregating or separating them out. One, and probably the most common, is going to be based off of social class. And when we talk about social class, it really is looking at socioeconomic class. So primarily houses that are priced the same are going to be built close together to each other, and they're going to attract a specific range or group of people who are earning a certain amount. Again, people who do not make a lot are not going to be able to afford $1 million homes, but if someone is in a upper echelon of economic success, they're going to do that, and then other people like them are also going to do that. The other one is land use. Again, there's going to be sort of a separation of where people live and where there are other types of activities like manufacturing. Again, zoning is how that works. If you've ever seen a sign on, like, again, a for sale sign on some land, it'll say for commercial use, for, again, residential use. Again, that is zoning. Again, that started happening in the early 20th century, deciding like what can be built where and why, with all that process going on. So when we look at this process of cities and expansion and stuff like that, again, in the United States, motor vehicles are the way that we've managed to be able to expand. People move out into the suburbs, but they're still driving into the cities. And we're going to see here that that, of course, has an impact on this whole process. Because we can drive and we have that freedom there, suburbs are going to get further and further away from the city center. And it takes up a considerable amount of space in United States cities. The fact that people are driving from the suburbs into the cities, an average city block is allocated about one fourth of its land to roads and parking lots, which is like a lot of that land. It's another reason that, again, cities have to build up, is that the ground levels are so condensed with so much people and so much stuff going on. We're going to see here too that, again, you got to get a lot of people into the cities in a quick way. So multi-lane freeways are going to cut these paths through hearts of cities. Elaborate interchanges get made. If you've been on to Milwaukee, again, you go through the Zoo interchange, the Marquette interchange. These are massive sort of spaghetti piled on top of each other roads, to be able to move people around in a fast and efficient way. And a lot of valuable land in central cities are devoted to parking. If people are driving into the city every day for work, they need to be able to put their car somewhere, and more of that land gets set aside for it. Of course, this whole process of America being very reliant on cars, working in the or living in the suburbs and working in the cities, is that all of those cars are putting out pollution. So one of the biggest issues with urban air pollution is going to be through the burning of fossil fuels, which of course it puts exhaust into the air, and that so on and so forth. Of course, there's also the issue of burning fossil fuels and how those are finite; they're running out. So at this moment in time, we're seeing there's been a lot of shifter attempts because we're not willing to give up our cars. We're going to keep holding on to those pretty tight. Automakers are trying to come up with alternatives, and we've talked about some of this stuff. So you've got diesel, and it looks like this is cut off a little bit. So you guys are going to need to pull up the other PowerPoint, the hard again, the regular one, to be able to get this. But we've got diesel. Diesel is one style or one approach that is going to be expensive, but it is better for, again, the long, because you can go further with diesel overall. It burns cleaner. There's hybrid cars, which are much more commonplace than they ever used to be, which is energy that would be wasted when you would coast or you'd be braking. It's reduced because an electric engine would kick in. There's ethanol, which again is our biomass energy, which we talked about in Unit 6. This is fuel made by distilling crops such as sugarcane or corn, soybeans. There's a lot of critics about this, of course. So you've talked about the issues with biomass is that, again, you're putting a lot of energy into growing crops, and then not a lot of energy is coming out of it in fuel. There's plug-in hybrids, which of course are going to be those who rely more heavily on the electric part of an engine. Electric motor supplies the power at all speeds, and then the gas engine can recharge the battery as well as by plugging it in. So it's a way to keep things moving. There's the hydrogen fuel cell. Hydrogen is forced through a polymer electrolyte membrane or proton exchange membrane, and that process creates energy. That one is much more expensive. It's something that is not as easily available to people overall. So again, just some images. This right here is looking at source of electricity, which we've seen this kind of stuff before. The last thing to talk about is this idea of public transportation. So again, in cities, those people who reside and work within cities almost always are going to consider giving up their vehicles because it is expensive and it is crowded and it's hard to maintain. So public transportation is going to be kind of where they end up. Of course, we know that cities are much more likely to have public transportation to get people off of the roads and into these different things. So, of course, there are a lot of benefits to public transportation. And in cities, it's better suited to be able to move lots of people. Each traveler, as an individual, takes up a lot less space when they're just themselves, as opposed to a car on the road. It's more cost effective than privately operated vehicles. You're not paying for gas or insurance or any of that kind of stuff. Emits relatively less pollutants than privately operated vehicles. That's really looking at amount. And it's more energy efficient overall. Of course, there are limitations. Most people in the United States overlook the benefits here because we like our own privacy. Again, it's nice to be able to get in your car and not have to interact with other people. And then there's the flexibility. But the schedule, you can go where you want, when you want, all that kind of stuff. And it's not offered in all United States cities, or at least a system that is beneficial for everyone is not offered in every city. So that's another limitation to public transport that is out there. But again, it's still something that is good and important to have in mind. So that is that. Again, is you can put your notebooks away. That's it for this particular slide. We only have one last little lecture, which will be on Wednesday. Don't forget, by the end of today on AP Classroom, you've got your Unit 5 progress check. We've got a Google Meet tomorrow. I know it says Thursday. I'm sorry for that. It's tomorrow, the 7th, again at 11 a.m. Again, we'll be talking about stuff from today, your city model project, the college board exam, which I have posted. Again, more information about the updated test. It's going to be a week later than the original exam date was on the 12th. Again, it's going to be online. All the information is on there. But if you have questions, feel free to swing by at 11 tomorrow to talk and ask me about them. You've got just a little bit of reading. Once you finish with that reading, you have read an entire textbook, which is a pretty cool accomplishment, I would say. Again, just reading the last key issue and getting that all finished up. And then the other big thing is by the end of this week, you guys are going to be submitting your city model project to me. So again, there are 3 things to be done: completing a 3D model, again, putting together a little video tour or a slideshow with pictures, and then writing up a 1-page report discussing the model that you were assigned. All of that information is on Classroom. If you have questions about it, of course, feel free to hit me up at any point, and I will get back to you. All right, guys, have a good one.